It was a picture-perfect home, sitting quietly at 431 Hillside Avenue, Westfield, New Jersey. A towering Victorian mansion that spoke of success, faith, and family. The kind of home you'd pass by and think they must have it all together, but inside those walls, something dark was brewing. Something no one could ever imagine. John Emil List was the father every neighbor respected, a devout Lutheran, a disciplined accountant, and a man who carried himself with the calm assurance of someone who did everything right. He had a wife, Helen, three beautiful children, Patricia, John Jr., and Frederick and his elderly mother, Alma, who lived upstairs. They attended church every Sunday. Their lawn was always perfect. Their Christmas cards showed nothing but smiles. But those smiles were hiding a slow, silent collapse. Behind the polished shoes and Sunday prayers, John List was drowning spiritually, financially, and mentally. The company he worked for had downsized, leaving him jobless. His savings were running out, the mortgage was piling up, and his wife's health was deteriorating fast. Helen was battling alcoholism and depression, haunted by an illness that had taken away her spark. The family that once looked like the American dream was falling apart behind closed doors. But John wasn't the kind of man to ask for help. He believed appearances were everything. Losing the house, his job, or his reputation wasn't an option. He believed his duty was to keep his family pure, no matter the cost. And in his mind, he started to believe something terrifying, that God himself was testing him. He spent more time in the study, reading scripture, pacing, and praying. His faith began to twist into something rigid, something absolute. He convinced himself that the world was too corrupt, that his children might lose their souls to sin, and that there was only one way to save them, by sending them to heaven before the devil could claim them. Outside, the neighborhood was peaceful. Children played in the street. The List family home stood tall and quiet, like a cathedral frozen in time. But inside, John was making plans. He organized his finances, stopped the newspaper deliveries, canceled milk orders, and wrote letters explaining his future absence. Every move was careful, calculated, cold. As the days ticked toward November 9, 1971, John List smiled at church, shook hands with neighbors, and watched his children laugh at the dinner table. No one could see the storm gathering behind those calm blue eyes. He believed he was about to do the right thing, the godly thing. He believed that when he was done, his family would thank him in heaven. No one suspected that within days that perfect mansion on the hill would fall silent, and the man who kept it spotless would become one of America's most chilling family annihilators. November 9, 1971. It was a cold, gray morning in Westfield, New Jersey. Inside the Grand List mansion, John List moved through the rooms with unsettling calm. He dressed in a suit and tie as if he were going to work, though he hadn't had a real job in months. Downstairs, the sound of the radio hummed softly, playing classical music, his wife's favorite. Helen sat at the kitchen table, sipping her coffee, unaware of what her husband had already decided. John approached her quietly. He raised his gun, a 9mm Steyr automatic pistol, and shot her once in the head. She never saw it coming. The cup slipped from her hand, shattering on the tiled floor. For a moment, the house went completely still. Then John walked upstairs. His mother, Alma, was having breakfast in her room. She looked up when he entered. "Is everything all right, John?" she asked. He said softly, "Yes, Mother, but not for long." He kissed her forehead, then pulled the trigger. She fell instantly, her body slumped beside the table she always prayed at. Downstairs, he dragged Helen's body into the ballroom and laid her on a sleeping bag. The music continued playing, serene, peaceful, cruelly indifferent. John cleaned the blood, changed his shirt, and waited. When his daughter Patricia came home from school, she dropped her books and smiled. "Hi, Dad." He nodded, leading her to the study under the pretense of a private talk. Moments later, a single shot echoed through the house. Then came Frederick, his younger son. He too was met with the same fate, one bullet, and silence followed. Only John Jr. remained, his oldest boy, the pride of his father. He was at soccer practice that afternoon. John waited for him to come home. When he did, John tried to carry on a normal conversation, but the mask slipped. The boy sensed something was wrong. A struggle broke out this time. John fired multiple times before his son finally fell. He later confessed that this part took the most strength. When it was over, he placed each of them side by side in the ballroom, covering them carefully. He turned the thermostat down low so the bodies wouldn't decay quickly. He cleaned every trace, turned on the house lights, and left the organ music playing softly on repeat. Before leaving, he sat at his desk and wrote a 5-page confession letter to his pastor. In it, he explained that he did not kill out of hatred or anger, but love, that he feared his family would fall away from God, and he wanted to ensure their souls reached heaven. Then he vanished, drove to the airport, left his car there to mislead investigators, and disappeared from the face of the earth. The mansion remained silent. The music kept playing, and for nearly a month, no one knew that the entire List family had been murdered by the man they trusted most. Days turned into weeks, and the grand List mansion stood untouched, frozen in time. The neighbors began to notice little things: the mail piling up, the milk bottles left on the doorstep, the newspapers collecting by the door. The Christmas lights still glowed faintly in the windows, even though no one had seen the family for weeks. The house looked alive, yet utterly lifeless. At first, people assumed the Lists had gone on a sudden trip. After all, John was known as a respectable, quiet man, someone who would never draw suspicion. But as the days passed, unease began to spread through the neighborhood. Friends of Patricia, the teenage daughter, began asking questions at school. She hadn't shown up in days, and no one had heard from her. The family's phone line rang endlessly, unanswered. Finally, on December 7, 1971, nearly a month after the murders, police were called to check on the home. When officers arrived, they were met with silence. The house was dark except for a few dim lights left on inside. The front door was locked, but the smell of something foul hung faintly in the air. When they stepped inside, they noticed the eerily normal atmosphere: dinner plates still on the counter, the radio softly playing organ music in the background. As officers moved deeper into the mansion, the chill of dread grew heavier. One officer pulled open a door to the ballroom, and what they found inside would haunt them for the rest of their lives. There, under the dim yellow light, lay the bodies of Helen, Patricia, John Jr., and Frederick, each carefully placed on sleeping bags, each shot once in the head. Their faces were calm, almost peaceful, as if they had been prepared for a final rest. Upstairs, they found John's elderly mother, Alma, dead in her room. The scene was methodical, deliberate, not the work of rage, but of ritual. A note sat on John's desk, neatly folded and addressed to his pastor. It detailed every action, every motive, every verse of twisted reasoning that led him to believe he was doing God's will. The police were stunned. They searched every corner of the house for signs of John, but he was gone without a trace. His car was found abandoned at JFK Airport, but there were no records of him boarding any flight. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. The news spread like wildfire across the nation. The image of the perfect Christian family shattered overnight. The List mansion became a symbol of horror, a quiet reminder that sometimes evil hides behind the calmest smiles. Reporters called it the House of Silence. People drove by just to stare at it, whispering about the man who murdered his family to save them. And as the world tried to make sense of the horror, one question remained: where was John List? For 18 long years, John List lived like a ghost, a man without a past, a killer hiding in plain sight. After abandoning his car at the airport, he boarded a bus and disappeared from New Jersey. The trail went cold. The FBI searched across states, checking shelters, churches, and airports, but there was nothing. It was as if John List had never existed. But he did exist under a brand new name. In Denver, Colorado, the man once known as John List became Robert Peter Clark. He crafted his new life with the same precision he used to plan the murders. He forged documents, built a new identity, and began attending church again. The congregation welcomed him warmly, a quiet, polite accountant who kept to himself and never raised suspicion. He found a job at an accounting firm, blending in seamlessly. The years passed, and in 1985, he remarried. His new wife Dolores had no idea she was living beside one of America's most wanted fugitives. They moved together to Richmond, Virginia, where he became active in the local Lutheran church once more, leading prayers, smiling, and shaking hands with the same calm composure he always had. Meanwhile, back in New Jersey, the List mansion decayed. It was eventually destroyed by fire in 1972. But the legend of the murders only grew stronger. Detectives refused to give up. But with no trace of John and no digital databases like we have today, every lead turned cold. John continued to live his double life, aging gracefully, paying his taxes, and pretending his past never existed. To his neighbors, he was Bob Clark, a man of faith, soft-spoken, devoted to his work and wife. But deep down, he remained haunted by what he'd done. Some nights he'd sit quietly in his study, staring at old Bible verses, justifying his actions all over again. Then in 1989, everything changed. A television show called America's Most Wanted decided to feature the long-forgotten case of the List family murders. Using forensic artistry, experts created a clay bust predicting what John List would look like after nearly 2 decades on the run. They added wrinkles, glasses, and graying hair, the details of an older man who still carried that same cold, analytical stare. When the episode aired, millions of viewers watched. Among them was a former neighbor of John's second wife in Denver. The moment she saw the clay bust, her heart dropped. She said it looked exactly like her old neighbor, Bob Clark. And within days, the FBI knocked on his door in Virginia. The quiet accountant who thought he had buried his past opened it and met the agents who had been chasing his shadow for 18 years. For the first time since 1971, John Emil List had nowhere left to run. When agents confronted the quiet man known as Robert Peter Clark, he didn't resist. He denied it at first, calmly insisting they had the wrong person. But the fingerprints told the truth. They matched perfectly. The man standing before them was not Bob Clark, not a mild-mannered accountant, not a church volunteer. He was John Emil List, the father who had murdered his entire family 18 years earlier. The world was stunned. News broke across every television station the ghost of Westfield had finally been found. The man who had vanished without a trace was living an ordinary life, attending Sunday service, paying taxes, and smiling for church photos. For nearly 2 decades, he had hidden behind faith and routine, believing he had outrun both the law and his guilt. But now the mask had fallen. In 1990, John List stood trial for 5 counts of first-degree murder. The courtroom was packed. Journalists filled every seat, and survivors of the victims' friends wept silently as the details were read aloud. The prosecution described a man of control, manipulation, and cold precision, a man who planned each killing to appear righteous. They read his confession letter to the jury, the one where he explained that he did it to save his family's souls from the sinful world. List sat quietly through it all, expressionless, emotionless, as if he were still trying to convince himself that what he'd done was justified. When the verdict came guilty on all counts, he showed no visible reaction. The judge called him a cold-blooded murderer, sentencing him to 5 consecutive life terms in prison. For the first time in his life, John List could not control the narrative. Inside prison walls, he lived quietly, much like he had before. He worked in the library, attended chapel, and spoke little about his crimes. In one rare interview years later, he said he regretted killing his family, but not for moral reasons. He said, "I wish I hadn't done it, but I still believe it was the only way to save them." That statement chilled the world once again. Even in captivity, John List remained convinced that he was serving a divine purpose. He died in prison in 2008 at the age of 82, leaving behind a legacy of horror and disbelief. The List mansion is long gone now, but the story never faded. Neighbors still remember the eerie silence, the glowing lights, the haunting organ music that played for weeks after the murders. It stands as a timeless warning that evil doesn't always look like a monster. Sometimes it looks like a father, a husband, a man sitting beside you at church. So as the final chapter closes, remember this: monsters don't always hide in the dark. Some hide behind faith, behind kindness, behind normal smiles. And if you want more untold stories like this, subscribe, follow, and stay with us. Because on the Untold Trace, the truth always finds a way to resurface.